My name is Master Sergeant Cole, retired, and at 62 years old I can tell you that my only church was the United States Army. My only prayer was self-reliance. And I had declared a personal war on God. It wasn't a quiet, private disagreement. It was a full-blown public declaration of hostilities. It happened on the dusty, sun-baked firing range at Fort Bragg in front of my entire platoon of fresh-faced recruits. I saw it hanging from the neck of a young private, a kid named Evans. A small worn wooden cross. I snatched it from his trembling hands, threw it on the ground, and with the full weight of my body, I ground it into the dirt with my combat boot until it was nothing but splinters. "You think this piece of wood is going to stop a bullet out there?" I roared, my voice echoing in the stunned silence of my men. Faith is a crutch for the weak. That was me. A man who saw faith not just as a weakness, but as an enemy to be crushed. If this story is already speaking to you in some way, if you've ever felt lost or angry like I was, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit that notification bell, and if you would, give this video a thumbs up. It really helps more people find these stories. And please, leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It means a lot to know we're not alone in this journey, no matter where we are in the world. To understand the man who would do something like that, you have to understand where I came from. I wasn't born a monster. I was born in a small town in Ohio, the son of a steelworker and a devout mother. My father taught me that you only get what you earn with sweat and calloused hands. My mother taught me to pray. For a long time, their lessons coexisted. But the world has a way of testing you, of forcing you to choose. The army was my choice. It was a world that made sense. It had rules, a clear chain of command and tangible results. You clean your rifle, you hit your target. You follow orders, you get promoted. There was no ambiguity, no room for maybes or mysteries. It was a fortress of logic and discipline, and I built my life inside its walls. My bitterness, my rage, it didn't come from the battlefield. It came from a quiet, sterile hospital room. It came from watching the woman I loved, my wife Sarah, get eaten away by cancer. I saw the strongest person I ever knew become fragile, her light dimming with every beep of the machines that were supposed to be keeping her alive. And in that room I did the one thing I was taught never to do. I got on my knees, I prayed, I begged. I pleaded with a God my mother swore was merciful. I offered him anything. I offered my own life in her place. All I got back was silence, the beeping of the machines, the sterile smell of antiseptic, and then, finally, the long, flat line of the heart monitor. In that moment, something inside me didn't just break. It hardened into something cold and sharp. I didn't just stop believing, I started hating. God to me became a negligent officer, an absent commander who abandoned his troops on the battlefield. And I would spend the rest of my life defying him. This defiance poisoned everything. My sister would call, excited about her Bible study group, and I'd call them a bunch of delusional fanatics waiting for a savior who wasn't coming. I'd visit my mother, and the sight of her sitting in her old armchair, her Bible worn soft with use, would fill me with a quiet, simmering rage. I saw her faith as a denial of reality, a refusal to see the cold, hard truth that we are alone, and that nothing is waiting for us on the other side. Every God bless you, every cross on a church steeple, every Christmas carol, they felt like personal insults, reminders of a vulnerability I despised, a hope I had begged for and been denied. So I attacked it, with brutal, relentless cynicism, which brings me back to that day at Fort Bragg. The heat was oppressive, the kind that makes the air shimmer over the baked dirt. The smell of gunpowder and sweat hung heavy. I was supervising a live fire exercise, and my recruits were nervous. They were just kids, trying to look tough, trying to hide the fear in their eyes. And then I saw him. Private Evans, a kid from some small town in Tennessee, barely old enough to shave, clutching that little wooden cross as he waited his turn on the line. He wasn't making a show of it. It was a quiet, personal gesture, but to me in that moment it was a flag of the enemy, waved right in my face. It represented everything I had come to hate, the false hope, the reliance on something unseen, the weakness of needing a crutch. I didn't even think. It was pure instinctual rage. I strode over to him, and the other recruits parted like the Red Sea. I saw the fear in Evan's eyes, but it was mixed with confusion. He had no idea what he'd done. I didn't say a word, I just ripped the cross from his neck. The thin leather cord snapped. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger for everyone to see, this pathetic little symbol. "This," I said, my voice low and dangerous, "is a lie." And then I threw it to the ground. I raised my boot, polished to a mirror shine that morning, and brought it down. The sickening crackle of splintering wood was the only sound on that range. I twisted my heel, grinding the pieces into the dust, making sure nothing was left. Then I looked up, my eyes sweeping over the pale, shocked faces of my men, and I delivered my sermon of disbelief. Faith is a crutch for the weak. Out here, you trust your rifle, you trust your training, and you trust the man next to you. Nothing else is going to save you. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. They weren't just looking at a tough master sergeant anymore. They were looking at a man who had just declared war on heaven itself, and I felt a grim, hollow satisfaction. I had made my point. I had no idea that my war was about to get a response I could never have imagined. My defiance on that range hung in the air, thick and metallic like the taste of gunpowder. I had made my point, drawn my line in the sand, but the universe, it seems, has a funny way of drawing a line of its own. The live fire exercise continued. The rhythm of commands, the crack of rifles, the smell of cordite, it was my sanctuary, the only church I had ever known. And I was its high priest of cold, hard reality. Next up was a grenade simulation, a simple drill. Toss a dummy, clear a position. We'd done it 1,000 times. I watched Private Evans step up to the line, his face still pale from our earlier encounter. He was a good kid, trying to be a good soldier, trying to bury the humiliation I'd heaped on him. That's what I demanded. You take the hit, you get back up, you follow the order. A corporal handed him the practice grenade, a solid blue chunk of inert metal. I stood back, arms crossed, my shadow long in the afternoon sun, judging. I watched him pull the pin, his movements a little shaky. He drew his arm back, his eyes fixed on the target downrange. And then the world went sideways. It wasn't the familiar, harmless clatter of the practice pin. It was a sound I knew from the darkest corners of my memory, a sound that bypasses your ears and sinks straight into your gut. The sharp, sickening clink of a live detonator, a live grenade. Time didn't just slow down, it shattered into a million sharp-edged pieces. I saw the grenade leave Evan's hand in a panicked, wobbly arc. It wasn't a clean throw. It tumbled through the thick, shimmering air, a dark green pineapple of death, and landed with a soft puff of dust not 10 feet from where I stood. It rolled once, twice, and came to a stop right beside my left boot. I could have counted the serrations on its cast-iron shell. I could see the little lever, the spoon, had flown off. 3 seconds, maybe 5 if you're lucky. Decades of training screamed at me, "Move! Dive! Get down!" My body knew the drill, but I was frozen. Paralyzed. My life didn't flash before my eyes. I didn't see my wife's face. There was just a profound, deafening silence in my own head. This was it then. The final punctuation mark on a life lived in defiance of fairy tales. The cold, hard logic I had preached for so long was about to claim me. No appeals, no higher court. Just physics and explosive force. A fitting end for a man like me, I thought, with a strange, detached calm. Annihilated by random chance on a dusty firing range, and in that final, stretched-out second before oblivion, one last thought pierced through the paralysis, a single, bitter, defiant curse aimed at the empty sky. "See, you weren't there for her, and you're not here for me, there's nothing." The world erupted. It wasn't a sound, it was a physical blow. The air turned into a solid wall of pressure that slammed into my chest, stealing the breath from my lungs. The sun was blotted out by a cloud of dirt, smoke, and white-hot metal shrapnel. I felt the ground heave beneath my boots like a living thing. I was thrown backward, not gently, but with the raw, violent power of a giant's hand swatting me away. I landed hard on my back, my helmet ringing like a gong. For a moment there was nothing, just the high-pitched whine of ruptured eardrums and the acrid smell of burnt cordite filling my nostrils. I must be dead. This was the void. The great empty nothingness I had always insisted was waiting for us. But then I felt something, a sharp grinding pain in my shoulder where I'd landed. I could feel the grit of the dirt against my cheek. I could taste blood in my mouth from biting my tongue. I blinked, and through the ringing in my ears the smoke began to clear. The sky was still there, a flat, indifferent blue. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, my body screaming in protest, my mind reeling in disbelief. I did a frantic soldier's self-assessment. Fingers, toes, arms, legs, everything was there. I ran my hands over my chest, my stomach. No holes, no blood, not a single scratch. My uniform was shredded in places, covered in a thick layer of dust, but my skin beneath it was unbroken. It was impossible. A fragmentation grenade at that range? It should have turned me into a red mist. It should have shredded me to pieces. But I was whole. And then, the silence was broken. Not by an all clear, but by the groans, the cries for a medic. My head snapped up and my blood ran cold. The impossible miracle of my survival was instantly eclipsed by a devastating, gut-wrenching reality. My men, the recruits. They were scattered across the ground like broken toys. Some were screaming, clutching at bleeding limbs. Others lay unnervingly still. And there, not far from where the grenade had landed, was Private Evans. He was on his back, his face a mask of shock and pain, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his uniform soaked in a spreading stain of dark red. The other instructors and medics were a whirlwind of motion, a flurry of controlled panic and shouted orders. But I couldn't move. I was still on the ground, staring at the carnage I was supposed to have prevented. Staring at the young men who had been wounded by the shrapnel that had somehow passed right through me. While I, the man standing in the heart of the blast, the man who had just cursed God, was completely, impossibly, unharmed. The looks on the faces of the soldiers who could still see were not looks of relief for their master sergeant. They were staring at me with something else. Awe, fear, a deep, unsettling confusion that mirrored my own. They weren't looking at a lucky survivor. They were looking at a ghost, at an anomaly that defied every law of physics and probability they knew. And in their eyes, I saw the reflection of my own shattered worldview. My fortress of logic, my impenetrable walls of self-reliance had just been leveled by a force I couldn't explain, couldn't fight and couldn't deny. My war was supposed to be with a God who wasn't there. But what do you do when the enemy you swore didn't exist not only shows up to the battle but saves your life while letting your men fall? The grim pride I had felt just minutes before was gone, replaced by a shame so profound it felt like it was going to crush my ribs. I was at the bottom of a hole so deep I couldn't even see the sky anymore. If you can feel the weight of that moment, if this story is resonating with you, please take a second to hit the like button and make sure you've turned on notifications. It truly helps us reach more people who might need to hear a story like this, and you won't want to miss how this all unfolds. The weeks that followed were a special kind of hell, one I hadn't found in any desert or jungle. The army, in its infinite bureaucratic wisdom, put me on administrative leave pending a full investigation. It was a formality. They knew the grenade was a factory defect, a one-in-a-million catastrophe, but the real investigation was the one happening behind my own eyes, every waking moment. I was a ghost in my own life. Soldiers I had known for years would avert their gaze when I passed. Their silence was filled with accusations my own mind was screaming at me. Why me? Why was I spared? The whispers followed me. They weren't calling me a hero, they weren't even calling me lucky. They were calling me a miracle. And it felt like a curse. My days became a blur of sterile hallways and the antiseptic smell of the base hospital. I'd sit by the beds of my wounded men, trying to offer words that felt like ash in my mouth. Most of them were too medicated to say much, but not Evans. Private Evans, the kid whose cross I had ground into dust, was lying there with his leg in a cage of metal pins and wires. The shrapnel had shattered his femur. He'd walk again, they said, but his army career was over before it had even begun. I'd walk into his room and he'd manage a weak smile. He never once looked at me with anger. He looked at me with that same unnerving awe I saw in everyone else's eyes. One afternoon, the silence in his room was too much to bear. "I'm sorry, Evans," I mumbled, the words feeling small and useless. "For everything." He just shook his head slightly on the pillow. "Don't be, Sarge," he said, his voice raspy. "God was watching over you." The words hit me harder than the blast wave of the grenade. It wasn't forgiveness, it was a verdict, a confirmation of the impossible truth I was desperately trying to deny. I was saved. He was broken, and his faith gave me the credit. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The nights were worse. Sleep offered no escape. When I did drift off from sheer exhaustion, the nightmares would come. I'd be back on the range, the sun beating down. I'd see the splinters of that little wooden cross scattered in the dirt. But then the splinters would start to glow with a terrible heat, and the ground would shake, and I'd be thrown back into the flash and the fire and the screams of my men. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs, the smell of cordite so real I could taste it. I stopped even trying to sleep. I'd just sit in the dark of my small empty house, a bottle of bourbon my only companion, and stare at the walls. The silence of that house was louder than any battle. It was the same silence I'd heard in the hospital room when Sarah's heart stopped, the silence of an absent God. But now, it felt different. It felt watchful. It was on the third or fourth night of this self-imposed torment. I don't know for sure that it happened. I wasn't asleep and I wasn't drunk. I was just sitting in my armchair, hollowed out, staring into the darkness. And the darkness began to change. It wasn't a dream. My eyes were wide open. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to deepen, to coalesce, until they weren't just shadows anymore. In the center of that profound blackness, I saw them. The splinters, the tiny, jagged pieces of Private Evans' cross. They were just hanging there, suspended in the air, broken and pathetic, a perfect recreation of my act of desecration. A cold dread washed over me. This was it, the judgment. The condemnation I knew I deserved. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the image was burned onto the back of my eyelids. I couldn't escape it. When I opened them again, something had changed. A light began to emanate from the splinters. Not a harsh, accusatory light, but a soft, warm glow, like the first light of dawn. It was coming from inside the broken wood itself, pouring out of the cracks and fractures. Slowly, impossibly, the pieces began to move. They drifted toward each other, guided by some unseen hand, and as they came together, the light sealed the breaks. The cross reformed itself before my eyes, no longer made of splintered wood, but of pure, gentle light. It pulsed with a quiet, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat, and I felt a presence in the room. It wasn't malevolent, it wasn't angry. It was a profound and overwhelming sense of sorrowful love, a mother's love. It was a feeling I hadn't felt since I was a small boy with a scraped knee, running to my own mother. It was the feeling I used to get when Sarah would just look at me from across a room. It was a presence that saw every ugly, bitter, broken piece of me, and it didn't turn away. It wept for me, and it loved me anyway. I didn't hear a voice. There were no words. There was only this feeling, this wave of unconditional mercy that washed over me, and it broke me. The fortress I had built around my heart, the walls of cynicism and rage, they didn't just crack, they crumbled into dust. The man who hadn't cried when he buried his wife, the master sergeant who believed tears were a sign of weakness, sat there in his armchair and sobbed. Not quiet, dignified tears, but gut-wrenching, soul-cleansing sobs that tore their way up from a place I thought had died long ago. I wept for Sarah. I wept for my men. I wept for the bitter, lonely old fool I had become, and for the first time I felt the full weight of my shame, not as a burden to be carried, but as a stain to be washed away. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the vision faded. The cross of light dissolved and the room was just a room again, but I was not the same. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a peace that made no sense, and in that peace, I heard a soft knock at my front door. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m. I wiped my face on my sleeve, my mind still reeling, and stumbled to the door. Standing on my porch, holding a thermos, was the base chaplain, a man I had openly mocked for years. He just looked at me, his eyes full of a tired kindness. "Couldn't sleep either," he said simply. "Figured you might need some coffee, and maybe someone to share the watch with." That conversation, sitting at my kitchen table in the dead of night, was the beginning of a new campaign, a new set of orders I never saw coming. If you're finding strength in this part of the journey, please take a moment to hit that like button and make sure you've turned on notifications. It helps these stories find their way to others who might be sitting in the dark, and you won't want to miss what happened next. That coffee with the chaplain wasn't what you'd think. He didn't preach. He didn't quote scripture at me or tell me God had a plan. He just sat there in the harsh light of my kitchen and listened. He listened to me try to dismantle the miracle. I threw everything I had at it. "It was the shock," I said, my voice hoarse. "Adrenaline. The human mind does strange things under pressure." I tried to sound like the old master sergeant, the one who had an explanation for everything. The vision of the cross. A guilt-induced hallucination. Classic PTSD. I've seen it a dozen times in kids coming back from deployment. I laid out my case like a battle plan, using all the clinical, detached language I could muster. Survivor's guilt. Auditory and visual phenomena triggered by extreme stress. Coincidence. A freak of physics where the blast wave created a pocket of safety. A 1 in a billion chance. I had an answer for everything. An answer that would let me put this whole thing in a neat little box, label it combat anomaly, and file it away. The chaplain just nodded, sipping his coffee. When I finally ran out of explanations, exhausted by my own logic, he just looked at me and said, "Must be tough, Cole, when your own eyes betray your orders." And that was it. He didn't argue. He just planted that one simple seed of doubt in the fortress I was trying so desperately to rebuild. And in the days that followed, that seed began to sprout. The world started playing tricks on me, or at least that's what I told myself. I'd be driving off base, and the shadow of a telephone pole would fall across the road, and for a split second, all I could see was a cross. I'd look up at the sky and 2 jet contrails would intersect at a perfect right angle, holding their shape for just a moment too long. I'd be in the commissary, and the way the fluorescent lights reflected off the polished floor would create a shape that made my breath catch in my throat. It was everywhere. A constant, silent reminder. I tried to dismiss it as hypervigilance, my mind now conditioned to see a pattern it was looking for. But it didn't feel like that. It felt intentional. It felt like I was being haunted, not by a ghost, but by a symbol. The shame was the worst part. It was a slow-acting poison. Every time I saw one of those accidental crosses, the memory of what I'd done on the range would come rushing back, not with pride, but with a hot, sickening wave of self-loathing. I'd remember the look on Private Evans' face, that mix of fear and confusion. I'd remember the sound of the wood splintering under my boot, a sound that now echoed in my nightmares. I'd remember the things I'd said to my sister about her delusional fanatics, the cold contempt in my voice when I'd spoken to my mother about her crutch. The man who had done those things, who had taken pleasure in that cruelty. I couldn't stand to be in the same skin with him. If you've ever felt that kind of internal battle, where who you were is at war with who you might be becoming, let me know this story is helping by hitting that like button. And make sure you've turned on notifications because you need to hear how this war ends. One afternoon I couldn't take it anymore. The 4 walls of my house felt like a prison cell. I got in my truck and just started driving, with no destination in mind. I ended up in the parking lot of the main base chapel. I'd walked past this building thousands of times over 30 years and never once given it a second thought, other than a cynical sneer. It was just a building. Wood, brick and glass, but now it felt different. It felt like enemy territory I was being ordered to scout. I sat in my truck for a long time, watching the sun glint off the simple cross on its steeple. The old Cole, the master sergeant, was screaming at me. "What are you doing here? This is the home of the weak, the headquarters of the lie you spent your life fighting." But another voice, a quieter one I didn't recognize, was just whispering, "Go inside." My hand was shaking as I opened the heavy wooden door. It was empty. The air was cool and still, smelling of old wood and lemon polish and something else, something like peace. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the rows of empty pews in jewel tones of red and blue and gold. It was quiet, a deep, profound silence that was the complete opposite of the ringing in my ears after the explosion. I felt like an intruder, a spy. Every step I took on the worn wooden floor seemed to echo like a gunshot. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my eyes darting around, taking in the alien landscape. The altar, the pulpit, the flags, and at the very front, hanging on the wall, was a large wooden crucifix. I stopped a few feet away from it, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the ultimate symbol of everything I had mocked and despised. I looked at the carved figure, the depiction of suffering. I had always seen it as a monument to weakness, to surrender, but now I saw something else. I saw a sacrifice. I saw a love so absolute it was willing to be broken. The same love I had felt in my living room, the presence that had wept for me. My logical mind was still fighting, still throwing up defenses. It's just a carving, Cole, a piece of art. It means nothing. But my soul, a part of me I didn't even know I had, knew better. My hand, as if it had a will of its own, reached out. I hesitated for a second, then I laid my palm flat against the wood of the cross. I didn't feel a jolt of electricity. I didn't hear a voice from heaven. I just felt the wood. It was cool and smooth beneath my calloused, trembling fingers, and in that simple physical contact, something inside me finally broke for good. The pride, the rage, the stubborn, bitter certainty that I was alone and in command. It all just dissolved. And in that silence, surrounded by the symbols of a faith I had declared my enemy, I finally lowered my weapon. I surrendered, not to an enemy, but to a mercy I had done nothing to deserve. The war was over, and I had lost. And somehow in that loss I had won everything. Walking out of that chapel was like stepping onto a new planet. The sun felt different on my skin. The air I was breathing felt cleaner, lighter. The war was over, but the battlefield was still littered with the wreckage of the man I used to be. The news, of course, had already spread across the base like wildfire. The story of the grenade, of my impossible survival, had become a piece of military folklore. But now when people saw me, they saw something else too. They saw the hard-bitten master sergeant, who now spent his afternoons sitting with the chaplain, not to argue, but to listen. The reactions were exactly what you'd expect. My old drinking buddies, the grizzled NCOs I'd served with for decades, thought I'd finally cracked. One of them, a first sergeant named Miller, pulled me aside at the mess hall. "Cole," he said, his voice low, "you need to see a shrink. It's combat fatigue, post-traumatic stress. Your mind is playing tricks on you, making you see things that aren't there. We've all been there." He was trying to help, trying to give me a logical box to put it all in. The old me would have been grateful for the excuse, but I just shook my head. "It wasn't a trick, Miller. It was the most real thing that's ever happened to me." He just stared, shook his head and walked away. He couldn't cross that line with me. My own sister, who had prayed for me for so long, was wary. On the phone, I could hear the hesitation in her voice. She was afraid it was some new form of extremism, that I had just swapped one kind of rage for another. She'd ask cautious questions, trying to gauge if I was stable. I couldn't blame any of them. How do you explain a miracle to people who live in a world of regulations and ballistics reports? You can't. You can only live it. The chaplain invited me to a small gathering at his house, a Bible study. The words alone would have made me sneer just a few weeks prior. Walking in there felt like infiltrating an enemy command post. These were the people I had mocked, but they didn't see a monster. They saw a man who was hurting. They didn't bombard me with questions or demand a confession. They just made room for me on the couch and handed me a cup of coffee. And as I sat there, listening to them talk about Scripture, I saw the cross again. Not in a vision, but on a simple chain around a woman's neck, in the pages of the Bibles they held. And for the first time, it didn't look like a symbol of weakness. It looked like an anchor. It was the symbol of the mercy that had found me in the dark, the love that had rebuilt me from the splinters of my own making. I didn't say much that night, but when I left, I felt lighter. I had found a new platoon. The true test, the final battle in my internal war, came about a month later. The base held a ceremony to honor the wounded soldiers from the grenade incident and to welcome them back. It was in the base gymnasium. The whole battalion was there. Medals were being handed out. Speeches were being made. I saw Private Evans in the front row, in his dress uniform, a cane resting against his chair. He caught my eye and gave me a small, genuine smile. Not the smile of a victim to his tormentor, but the smile of a brother. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. The commanding officer finished his speech, and before he could dismiss the formation, I walked up to the podium. A hush fell over the gymnasium. A master sergeant doesn't just grab a microphone. My hands were shaking. I looked out at all those faces, the men I had trained, the officers I had served under. "You all know me as Master Sergeant Cole," I began, my voice unsteady. "And you know me as a hard man. A man who taught that faith was a crutch, a man who believed only in what he could see and touch." I took a deep breath. "I'm here to tell you I was wrong." I looked directly at Private Evans. "Private Evans, I stand before you as a man who publicly humiliated you. I took a symbol of your faith, a cross your mother probably gave you, and I destroyed it in the dirt because I was an arrogant, broken old fool. I did it out of pride and anger at a God I had cursed. And I am profoundly, deeply sorry." Tears were streaming down my face now. I didn't care. "And then," I continued, my voice cracking, "that same God I cursed, that same faith I mocked, reached into the heart of an explosion and pulled me out without a scratch, while you brave men paid the price. I can't explain it with physics. I can't explain it with logic. I can only tell you that the thing I tried to grind into dust on that range was the very thing that raised me up from it." I paused, letting the words hang in the silent room. My war is over, not the one in the desert, the one in my heart. I've learned that true strength isn't in a rifle or in your own two hands. It's in the humility to get on your knees. It's in the mercy you don't deserve, but are given anyway. I stepped back from the microphone, my confession complete. The silence was absolute, and then someone started to clap. It was Evans pushing himself up on his cane, his applause echoing through the gym. Then another soldier joined in, and another, until the entire room was on its feet, not for a master sergeant, but for a broken man made whole. My journey didn't end there, it began. It wasn't about changing my religion, it was about my heart being changed for me. It was about trading a lifetime of bitter pride for a single moment of grace. The fortress I built to keep God out became the temple where I finally met him, and my life is a testament to the fact that it is never, ever too late to surrender. If this story has touched your heart, if you've ever felt that kind of brokenness or witnessed that kind of mercy, please do me a favor and hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss more stories of hope like this one. And most importantly, I want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell me one moment where faith showed up in your life when you least expected it. Your story matters because it's a piece of the same miracle that saved me. Thank you for listening.